It was 2007. I'd been hooked with pretty hard luck, and over the past few years, I hadn't managed to really get myself on the property ladder. I had 2 small kids, and a husband that I didn't really get on with, but we kept going nonetheless. We were more like friends, it was like we were duty-bound, we just stayed together for the kids. And that was the only reason why. My husband lost his job, and as a result, we couldn't keep up payments with rent. So we had to downsize massively, which I felt bad for because now my 2 kids would have to sleep in the same bedroom. Thankfully they had separate beds, as to me that is a must, however I didn't want them sleeping in the same room. Past the age of 9 or 10, as I just thought that was kind of weird and in a sense against their privacy. I know there are some siblings that sleep in the same room all the way up until their adulthood, they just get used to it, or they have no choice so they have to get used to it. I worked very hard during my younger years, saving money was tough, and it felt like for every dollar I saved, $2 was being taken out of my bank. I'm not going to sit here and moan about how hard my life is, because as a whole, it was pretty easy. I could have been born in Africa, I could have been born somewhere in the Middle East, having missiles dropped on my own house. I get that people have it way worse. There's always someone in a more difficult and more strike of bad luck situation. We decided that we had no choice but to eventually downsize. My husband went through massive depression, refused to come out of the bedroom for most of the day, and wouldn't even search for a second job after being fired from his first one. This turned into me looking after 3 kids rather than 2. I was making them all food, working full-time and cleaning the house. My husband would occasionally not even cooperate with paying the bills or taxes. And to me, that just felt like another kid. I didn't respect him, and I definitely didn't love him anymore. But I guess without him, what happened to us in the second house could have been a whole lot worse, or it could have been a whole lot better depending on how you look at it. So this all begins when we finally decided that we had to downsize to a 2-bed property from the 3-bed one that we were originally living in. The rent in the 2-bed property was only just over $1,000 per month. Our 3-bed property was $1,400. We couldn't make up the $400 difference. So we had no choice but to pick the cheaper one, on the other side of town. When we got there, it was evident that this place was a whole lot cheaper. The people around the area, the designs of the houses, the trash on the front yard, and the kids with no respect just cycling in the middle of the road in your way as you're driving the car. I could sense the whole vibe of this place was off. It smelt like pure, it smelt like theft. It smelt like poorness. I'm saying this, probably coming across as some royal family member. But that's not the case. I've been both rich and poor. And as I write this story, I am doing very well for myself. But this is almost 20 years on now. Don't forget that. When we got shown around the house, I was shocked at how small all the rooms were. They were cramped, there was mold in the top corners, and the house smelt damp. I didn't want to make my kids sick, so the first thing I set about was cleaning the mold myself and trying to figure out what was actually causing it. The landlord we had was a short Spanish guy, and quite frankly, I got the era that he didn't care shit what we thought of his property, as long as we paid, that's all he cared about. That's how it is with 99.9% of landlords. I get the vibe that most of them simply inherit the property from their dads, granddads, or someone in their close family. Most don't even know what they're actually doing, all they care about is pocketing that money at the end of each month, and if they don't, then they just kick out, rinse and repeat. Except for the past 2 months at our old 3-bed property. I didn't make the decision that some bad tenants would, which would be to barricade myself in the house and wait out until a court statement ordered me to get out. We're normal humans, we have manners and standards, or at least I do. I don't think my husband does anymore. I'll have to check. We didn't introduce ourselves to our neighbors, as at the time we didn't really see much activity in the house next door. It didn't look very inviting. The car was rusted, it had no tires on it, and there was a few bits of trash all over their tiny front yard. There was a children's play bicycle, a couple of scooters, and an old, snapped-up skateboard. It looked like some dumping ground or some trash can site. We weren't going to entertain any of the weirdos around here. I wanted to shelter my kids, but I'd do anything than take a welfare check. My dad had always taught me that, not through words, but through actions. At one point in his life, he was almost homeless, but he would have rather that than accept anything from the government. I don't know why, but he was so against it. We had been at the house for a couple of weeks and were finally starting to settle down. The neighborhood wasn't as bad as I made it out to be earlier, although on first inspection and impressions, it did look dreadful. With loud music going on till 2 in the morning, there wasn't much gunfire, screaming, shouting, thefts, or aggravation like you would expect from an area that I just described. I was out in the yard on the 3rd week. We had a small backyard, but at least we had one, so I was grateful. My kids were booting a soccer ball about, and I remember setting up this goalpost. They'd kick it at the goal, and if they scored, it would hit the net. If they missed, it would bang against the house wall, causing me to yell at them, earn them to run inside or giggle. The family felt a little bit more relaxed now. And my husband had finally started the long and ordeal search for another job. He's a skilled worker, so his labor is needed, but I could tell he was still hesitant about getting one. He had a CBA attitude, like he had just given up on life, and that's not the type of guy I need in my life right now. It was bad, like a 3rd child. While I was out in the yard, my kids were booting the soccer ball around. I was still learning my ropes around this place. There was a little shed at the very bottom of the yard, and I'd set out that today would be the day that I would investigate the shed. Believe it or not, I had been so overturned with work that I hadn't even gone into this shed to see what was actually there. Seeing as the door was virtually impossible to wedge open. The landlord had told us that this had all the equipment for landscaping and gardening, it had tools, and even an old mower if we needed to use it. I thought that would come in handy, as it was summertime and the grass was starting to grow a little long for my liking. As I finally wedged open the door, I could see my husband stood in the top window looking at me. I probably caught his attention because I was doing something out of the blue, which I hadn't told him that I was going to do. As I looked up at my husband, all of a sudden I caught a flash out of the corner of my eye, the type of flash that comes from a cell phone or a camera when someone takes a photo. The flash came from the direction of the eye. Immediately looked over and saw a figure just stood there taking a photo of me. Then, a few seconds after I look at them, they realize I've seen them and they just duck down under the window ledge. It made me feel really uneasy and extremely uncomfortable. I stopped what I was doing and slammed the shed door shut and paced my way up into the house. I got my 2 kids, yelled at them to pick up the soccer ball and went back into the house and locked the door. I told my husband what I saw, and he told me that there's nothing we could do. I fucking hated him. He was so lazy, he didn't give a shit about anything, and I guarantee if someone broke in the house, he would just look at them and go, "Take it." I really needed to do something, as I couldn't have my kids playing in the yard. If we had a creep of a next-door neighbor. It had actually been 3 weeks, and at this point I still hadn't actually seen the neighbor leave their house. The same old rusted car without any wheels on, the same old electric bicycle that was rusted and half snapped in half, and the usual trash that seemed to be stuck in place on their rotten yard. Everything had stayed put for almost a whole month. And although we didn't spend our days looking out the living room window waiting to see someone leave or come, it wasn't a case of that. I never heard or saw any action from next door. The fact that that happened, and also we hadn't heard or seen them, made us all feel a bit uncomfortable. I know my husband didn't really care, but deep down he kind of did, if that makes sense. I went round to the house with the help of my husband. I managed to convince him that evening, and when we knocked on the door, no one answered. I knocked even harder and even started calling up, "Hello? Number 18, number 18. I wanted to let them know somehow that we weren't salesmen, cops, or someone trying to annoy them. But did that really matter if these people were creeps? I don't think so. Me and my family have done nothing wrong, And other than my two youngest booting the ball against a fence, occasionally making a banging noise, we had done nothing towards this person to warrant that behavior. They refused to answer the door, and my husband told me to come away by the fourth go of knocking. As I stood there, I wanted to kick the damn door down. I swear I could have. It was a flimsy, cheap piece of shit. And parts of the wood on the frame were actually rotting away. My husband grabbed me by the hand and pulled me back down the steps. We walked back to our house and sat back in the living room arguing for the whole night. It turns out that that wouldn't be the only unusual encounter we had had with our next-door neighbor. After this happened, I was reluctant to let my kids play out in the yard. I told them to keep an eye out, and if they see anyone next door in the window, that they're to come in immediately. Well, a few days later, my kids were playing out in the yard. High school had just finished and they were kicking the ball around again. I was finishing up some food as I was eating a late lunch. I'd worked half a day, so made myself a ham sandwich and I was eating it at the kitchen island. All of a sudden, as I take a few more bites, the two kids come running in. "Mommy, Mommy. The man's there again. He's got the camera." I drop my sandwich and spit out the bites I just took. They don't even land on the plate and go all over the kitchen side. I get up off the stool and run straight to the landing. Then I take a look out. There was no one in the backyard and there was no one in the front yard of their property. I ran back down the stairs, came out to the opening doors, yelled at my kids to stay inside and slammed the door behind me. I ran to the end of the yard where the shed was and looked straight up to the back window. When I looked at both of their back bedroom windows, were curtains drawn and I couldn't see anyone there. I brought one of my kids out and told them, "Is this how it looked when you were here?" "No, the man was standing there, the curtains weren't drawn, Mummy," he replied. I brought him back inside. My husband had been at work now as he had managed to get himself a second job, but I wanted him to be here as I felt like I was losing my mind. I locked both my kids in the house as I went back around next door and started banging on their door. This time someone did answer the door and the creepiest thing happened to me. The person who answered the door wore gloves, a mask and had the camera in their hand. This person was tall, looked around 40 years old and had long grayish/white dyed hair. Just looking at this person made me feel weird, uneasy, and creeped out. They had white eyebrows, so I don't know if they were albino, but that has nothing to do with this right now other than the fact that they made them look creepier as fuck. "Can you stop taking photos of us?" I said to them. The person didn't talk at all, and it got to the point where I was just outright cussing them because of how angry I was. I had been cussing at this person for a while and realized they weren't even paying attention to me. They raised the camera and took a photo of me and then slammed the door shut in my face. I ran up to the door and began slamming it with my open hand. I felt like I was going nuts and started screaming on my knees. I got back up and went round to my house again. When I went to try and unlock the door, I noticed that the door was still open. What the fuck? I remembered locking it only 10 minutes ago. I was certain of it. Then, as I tried to handle, I realized it had been busted in. The hinges and the locks were completely snapped off. Like they had been broken clean off of themselves. I tried to turn the handle, but there was no mechanism for it to turn, as all the metal was bent in and the frame had been snapped off. I started to panic and barge my way through the door. When I got into the house, I was screaming for my two kids, but there was no reply. I ran upstairs and searched every single room, continually screaming their name, begging that they answer my cries. Then I go back down, they're nowhere to be seen. When I get out into the yard, I see that they're both there. They're waving at the guy. And the scariest part, when I get out into the yard, further down where they are, I look up at the window, stood with the tall guy with the long white hair, is my landlord, this short Spanish guy. He was stood there, and for a brief second I got a glance of him. I was certain it was him, then he walked out of view, and the tall guy with long hair quickly pulled across the curtains. The third time this went down my husband was home. We called the cops, and they said there was nothing we could do, as everything they were taking photos of were within plain view of what they could see. We requested the rest of our money back as we paid for 3 months up front. We got it back and we moved to another place that cost a bit more now that my husband had actually got a job. This was a bizarre experience, and I know for a fact that our landlord was trying to stalk on my kids. Yeah. It's creepy. Be careful if you rent and you have kids. A lot of the times people look for hidden cameras, but in my case, there were no hidden cameras. Instead, they were visible cameras, out in the open cameras, and obvious cameras. This guy didn't care if we saw him, as he probably has done this before, and knows that some part of the law or constitution protects him. Being a creep shouldn't be protected, but I guess it's that gray area. There was no way I was just going to always say no to my kids being out in the yard. I'm sorry. And what I wanted to know is, what is that guy doing with those photos? That's something I can't really live with. The thought of why the police wouldn't take further action. The guy's defense was that he was taking photos of the trees behind the property. Sure, if they got a warrant for that camera, I guarantee we could disprove that in a matter of seconds. The place we live now is way better. The kids have their own bedrooms, and me and my husband have finally got our relationship slightly back on track. Female 31, I have no kids, a boyfriend and a brother who live with me at my house. I've been paying the mortgage since I was 21 years old, and I got on with my neighbors Brian and Angela extremely well. In 2013, Angela passed away from cancer. She'd been fighting with it for months until eventually it took her. I think she was doing some of the treatment, but it only made her worse, and if anything, shortened her lifespan, in my opinion. Brian was the type of guy that would really get depressed if anything ever happened to a friend or family member. We'd have barbecues round their house virtually every weekend in the summer. Being with these two lightened up my week. And although sometimes I'd have arguments with my brother because of how lazy he was and how he would never leave the house, being with Brian and Angela made me forget about all of that. And even better, my brother got on with them, which is rare because he doesn't really get on with anyone. When Brian died, that was a whole nother ballgame. Brian was my favorite. It came unexpected. It was after 4 days of him not leaving the house. I tried to check up on him by knocking on the door. He would always answer, especially if it was me. I tried calling his cell phone and his landline, but he just wasn't answering anyway. I tried to meet up or connect with him. This is when I decided to call the rest of his family. They said they hadn't heard from him either, and that he wasn't on holiday, as far as they were aware. His sister came down with a key. She opened the door, and that's when we found him dead in the kitchen. He had a blood clot in his brain, nobody saw it coming, and he'd been dead for days. I remember that morning, it made me feel violently sick, and once his body was taken away in the bag, I ran to my bathroom and spent the next 3 hours throwing up my guts. Once there was nothing left to throw up, I went back to bed. I laid there for a while, thinking about my own mortality. Most in shape person eating all healthy organic. And something can happen. I wasn't thinking that before. I was kind of in an automated mindset that, oh, everyone lives until 90, and it's a slow, painful, and expected death. That's not the case. Once I had been lying in bed for an hour or two, my stomach was hurting like crazy. When my husband got home from work, I broke the bad news to him. I hugged him all night long and wouldn't even let go of him. I became scared of losing anyone else, and even though I didn't love Brian, I knew him as a neighbor. He was a close friend, and he meant a lot to not only me and my husband, but also my brother. When he passed, my brother changed. He no longer had a friend to go fishing or drinking with. Brian was my brother's only friend, and I knew it would affect my brother for the worst. As we moved on, the weeks passed, and eventually, the family did the house up and went to sell it on. I remember that for sale sign being put up. It was like an era, a new era. A mark of the new chapter, the new beginning of who our neighbors would be. It took around a whole month until eventually people started to show interest. It started with more property developers taking tours around the house. They came with clipboards and work vans. I pray to God that they didn't buy the damn place. The last thing I needed was one of these plots to be turned into one of those massive fake plastic mansions. It would attract so much more, and if anything, give us a whole year of hell. Drilling, hammering, scaffolding, dirty burping builders, that's the last thing we needed, and I knew for a fact my brother would not get on with any of them, let alone even allow it. Around 13 people came for viewings. I counted each group and based them off of how they looked, dressed, and acted. It took a while for someone to finally buy the house, a whole 8 months. People put offers in over 100 grand below the asking price, which I found kinda hilarious to be honest. They had the audacity to do that, which just shows the amount of respect nowadays some people have. The sister ended up taking an offer that was 40 grand below the asking price. That was even when she had dropped the asking price for 50 grand, so it wasn't too good, but 7 months of waiting was just too long for her, and she needed the money to pay off her debts. Brian had left everything to her, because she was his only family member left alive, so it made sense. The first day that they took that for sale sign down and replaced it with sold, my heart started to flutter. It started to flutter with excitement, anticipation, but also dread and fear. On one hand, you could get amazing neighbors, ones that could help you out and teach you so much, while on the other hand, you can get absolutely assholes. Guys that are nasty, criminals, thieves, and fuckwits. I prayed to God every night, sometimes twice a night, that we would please have decent, good, loving neighbors. I knew whatever we got, they could never replace Brian and Angie. That was for sure. I was sat in my front room just having some dinner with my friend. She had come round for the day, and we'd been out walking in the Central Park. We noticed a car pull up onto the drive, and that's when I realized this wasn't Brian's sister, it was the new owners. I ran over to the window and peeped my eye out of the blind. As I looked out, I could see a guy, another guy, and another guy. There were 3 fully grown men, tattooed up, looked like they were fresh out of prison. Oh my fucking God. My brother is not gonna like this. I tried to stay optimistic, barred as I opened the window. All I can hear is fuck this and fuck that. And all this, cuss that. It was so disrespectful. That kind of talk didn't belong around this area. I tried to tell my brother to stay out of any hassle, not talk to them and not even get involved with anything. He didn't like the idea of those 3 guys living in Brian and Angie's house, but I tried to explain to him, it wasn't their house anymore. They had been living there for a couple of weeks, and we hadn't really spoken to them. They were extremely loud, obnoxious, and antisocial. But this day, it topped it all. They were building a fence. They started building a fence all around the front yard, which is against planning and completely illegal. We reported them and the guards weren't due to be set out. Another 4 days, in which time they would have done the fence and could try and argue that it's up now, so what's the point in taking it down? I had many arguments with my brother, locking the front door and trying to stop him from going out there, but one day he got out the back door and went out to the front. Now my brother's 68. He's covered in tattoos also, and has spent 4 months in prison himself. I take care of him to try and steer him out of trouble, but it seems to me like he's always looking for it. When he got out that back door and I heard him start yelling at the guys fitting the fencing, my heart sank into the pits of my stomach. The yelling soon turned into violence, and before I knew it, by the time I'd unlocked the front door, I opened it. See the 3 guys on top of my brother, mauling him alive. 2 of the guys were pummeling at his face, one of the guys had grabbed him by the stomach and was repeatedly hitting him there. I ran over to them, tried to grab them off him, but the one I grabbed stood up and punched me square in the face. I went flying, and I remember seeing nothing but darkness until eventually I came round. When I came round, the 3 guys were still on my brother, but they had stopped punching him. My head was banging, my ears were ringing, and my eyes for some reason were so blurry that I could barely make out who was who. When my vision started to improve, I saw the guys on top of my brother. He looked dead, he wasn't even moving, and he was totally lifeless. I decided that I was going to crawl my way back to the house and try and call 911. They didn't do anything else to me, and the three of them got off my brother. When I called the ambulance, they turned up, they took my brother away, and he had to be put in a coma. I cried and cried for days and days. After 2 months, he eventually got induced or undused. I can't remember what the term is as I'm not a doctor, but one thing I can say is that I lost my job because of my brother. I spent all day every day sat by his hospital bed, and as a result they fired me from my job. Financially, I'm okay though, but without my brother I'm not. He's a big guy, but he couldn't handle 3 of them. The 3 guys next door were charged and arrested and thrown back in prison for another half a year. Their defense attorney said that they were defending themselves. There were no cameras that showed the fight, so there was no evidence of how it started. Only hearsay based on those 3, and then my brother and me, but during the case, my brother couldn't say anything. He couldn't give a testimony. He couldn't give a hearing. He wasn't even there. He was in the hospital bed, fighting for his life. Male 29. I woke up at 2 a.m., I found my neighbor's apartment on fire, and I genuinely had no idea what to do. Most people would probably call the fire department, but I stood there, completely petrified. My body was stuck, it had turned to stone and wouldn't even move from the very position that I stood in. I've been living in this apartment for the past few years. I didn't really know anyone until the last year. I met Nathan when he moved in. It's kinda clumsy how we met, but it just so happened that I accidentally scraped his car while trying to reverse into my parking spot. In this apartment complex, everyone has allocated bays. You pay monthly rent, and in it is your utilities, your rent for the apartment, and your renting of the parking spot. It was late at night, and I may or may not have had too much to drink. I was a bit clumsy and ended up just judging the shot. I misjudged it so bad that I ended up scraping the back left side of this guy's car. He came out when I knocked on his door. He was actually sleeping and answered the door in his boxers, which I found kind of funny seeing as I was drunk. He said that I was laughing at his face, but when I explained him what happened, both of us got a little more serious. From that day onwards, we started talking a lot more. We'd joke, meet up for drinks, and just go and hang out places. We're both single, so we used to spend a lot of time together, just as mates. When Nathan finally got a girlfriend, I stopped seeing so much of him. Especially when she moved into his apartment, it was like a whole nother him. When I woke up that night, I remember that I had forgotten something in my car, so I went down to grab it. Once I got done grabbing it, I locked my car back up and ran back up the steps to my apartment. My apartment is on the 4th floor of this complex, so it's pretty annoying and tiring. Seeing as the building is yet to still have a lift implanted. When I got up to the top floor, I realized that I could smell burning. The 4th floor had a decent view. I stopped and turned around and tried to look out the windows, maybe thinking that someone had a bonfire or someone was letting off fireworks early. But that wasn't the case at all, as I kept smelling. I realized that the smell of smoke was coming from inside the building, so the only logical explanation was that the burning smells were coming from someone's apartment. I got to my apartment door and unlocked it. I went inside and the smell was so strong. I searched my entire apartment, made sure my dog was okay, and I made sure that the smell definitely wasn't coming from any of my rooms. All of my chargers were turned off, the TV wasn't on, and the gas cooker was off, so I was all good, but someone else definitely wasn't. I went back out into the corridor, and by this point the whole corridor had been saturated in smoke. My eyes started to water and sting really bad, so I had no choice but to be forced back into my apartment to shut the door. The fire alarm started going off, seeing as the smoke had triggered the alarm. The sirens started firing, and it wasn't long before everyone had woken up in the entire complex on all floors. With us being at the top, it meant that we had the biggest job at trying to get down and evacuating this damn place. Seeing as there was no lift, I didn't have to worry about getting stuck inside it. But I sure was scared that I was gonna burn to death along with my dog. When I grabbed all my stuff, I started to hear the sirens in the distance. I started to pack up my laptop, expensive clothes, and of course my dog. All the things that mattered to me and of course had value, I tried to cram in these massive suitcases to take down with me. I did something pretty naughty. Something we were all told not to do by the firefighters down below. I opened the door to take another look, and when I did, the apartment next to me, its door, was engulfed in flames. I started to panic and slammed the door shut once again. It was at this point where I started hearing splashes noises. These splashing noises were the sounds of the hosepipe putting out the fire. The firefighters had located the source and people on the first, second, and third floor had been evacuated. Now that the fire department were on the fourth floor, they were working on saving each person, but more importantly they had now found the source, which was Nathan and his girlfriend's apartment. When we finally got evacuated, I was looking all around for Nathan. I'll be honest, I didn't even know his girlfriend and I'd only ever seen her face a couple of times on a few occasions. I searched the entire parking lot, carrying my dog and my 2 crammed full suitcases, but the whole time, I couldn't find him. I went to the parking lot where he parks his car, the bay right next to mine. He wasn't in his car, and his car was still there. When I heard the bad news, I fell to my knees. He was a good friend for a whole year. He had burned alive with his girlfriend, they had left one of the stoves on, and somehow a fire had ignited in the kitchen. The investigators concluded that the smoke alarm in their building/apartment room had actually died due to a flat battery, meaning that because of a flat battery they both burnt to death. Or most likely got trapped, woken up by the smoke, and then burnt to death while alive. I can't think of a worse way to go, and my heart kind of feels like melting just by telling you guys this story. I don't know if I can class this lady as my neighbor, but for this story's sake I will. She lives 2 roads away and for some weird reason decided to target our house. This lady, who called herself Iris, had pretty bad dementia and for the past 2 years had been walking around to all of the houses knocking on the doors trying to introduce herself. Deep down, I think she was lonely, seeing as she lived alone and had no one to keep her company. On occasions, I didn't want to be rude, so I answered the door to her. She's completely lost her mind, she thinks I'm her friend or family member and keeps inviting me back to her house to have dinner. One time, I accepted and went back with her. She cooked me up food that was 1 year out of date. She was using milk that was 2 weeks out of date, and to be honest, it was a damn near miracle that she wasn't dead because of all this out of date food she was eating. I would just listen to what she had to say, as for some weird reason I felt bad for her. I knew that in amongst the mental health issue and the disease she was going through, there was still a lady, that was once a girl, that was once a baby, that is a soul. She had been pissing off the entire neighborhood. 5 in the morning, she would go round to every house, asking them if they wanted to come round for dinner. She was convinced that I was her auntie. I have no idea how that makes any sense seeing as I'm 40 years younger than her. I didn't know her age until she finally got taken into her home, however she was around 88 years old. This lady had no family members and unfortunately her house was put up for auction. There was one night where she scared the shit out of both me and my family. My teenage son had the job of locking up the house. It was a Friday night and he had been out clubbing on the drinks. He had completely forgotten to properly lock the door, as he has done a couple of times. We hear someone walking around downstairs and just assume that it's him. But then I hear the all too familiar mumbling and humming. The same noises I hear from Iris whenever I meet her or go round her house. There's nothing more terrifying than knowing that an old lady is inside your house at 3 o'clock in the morning when she shouldn't be. The second I heard her mumbling, I instantly knew it was her. I jumped out of the bed and banged my husband on the head to wake him up. I ran to my wardrobe and threw on some clothes. Then I made my way downstairs to find Iris in the kitchen making herself some food with food from our fridge. The problem with dementia is getting angry with them doesn't work, it makes it worse. Once the adrenaline had finally died down and the thought of someone actually breaking into my house went away, I realized that this lady was no threat at all. but her presence scared the hell out of me and my husband. And for a while, I thought my husband was gonna come out with his gun. I continued to help her make some food. She ended up making herself a salad with some leftover chicken. And for whatever reason was adamant that she wanted to add grapes, blueberries, and cereal. Not a great combination. Every time I tried to stop her from adding the cereal and breweries, she would fight back and try and grab the box. I didn't want to annoy her or make her angry as my kids were still asleep, so I just went along with it. Once she finally got done with eating the food, I walked her back to her house and told her that she can't come back. I made up a lie saying that we were all going out, and thankfully it actually worked. She later came back at 10 a.m., so I got a few more hours sleep until eventually I was woken up again. I remember to lock the door this time so she couldn't get in, and I didn't answer the door. I looked out the window and remembered seeing her shuffling back down the drive. She tried to knock on everyone's windows and doors once again, and I thought to myself, this simply can't go on. The neighbors decided to call the cops on her, which I thought was kinda harsh, but I get that they didn't like being harassed. After around 5 months of this, the neighbors couldn't take it anymore. After over 200 police complaints, they decided to put her in her home, and I think that was best for her. I do kinda think about her from time to time and worry if she's okay or not. But I know that she's with professionals, and after all, we're not her family, but I wish she had some